part. All right. Welcome to another curatorial conversation. My name is Joy Davis, and I am the manager of adult and community programs here at the Walters Art Museum. I have the pleasure today to have a discussion with Christine Sciacca, Associate Curator of European Art from 300 to 1400. Thank you so much, Christine, for being here. I'm so excited to get into our conversation.
Thanks, Joy. I appreciate it.
And so we're going to start with one of your favorite pieces in the collection. What is this particular piece, and what is it all about, and what drew you to this piece?
Well, I do have several pieces that are my favorites in the collection at the Walters. It's kind of like trying to pick your favorite child. But one of my very favorites is this diptych by a follower of the artist Frey Seon. And it depicts in the left wing the Virgin Mary, or Mary, the mother of Jesus, with Jesus. And on the right-hand side, a series of apostles and saints who turn towards Mary and Christ in adoration. And this diptych comes from Ethiopia. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to get into that. I don't know if you mentioned it prior, but what is a diptych, and what is its importance?
So a diptych just means a painting or an object made out of two panels. So you're looking at two wood panels here that have been painted with the scenes that you see. And originally would have been hinged together, kind of like a small book. And diptychs can come in, so diptychs can come in a variety of sizes. This particular one is about the size of a medium-sized book. So I'm just going to show my copy of my dictionary here. And if you were to open it up, you could see me over the top for scale. This is about the size of the diptych. So it's sort of book size, and it would have hinged kind of like a book as well.
And we do see kind of remnants of that binding in the image, it looks like.
Yes, we have a couple of holes down the center there where there would have been cords wound through that to kind of sew it together. And so it would have been a flexible piece where you could open and shut it. So the fact of the scale of this one meant that it was the kind of object that could have been held in the hand, kind of like you would expect a book to be, or set upon an altar originally.
Wonderful. And I'm curious, what were these particular, these diptychs or these tomes used for?
So these diptychs were used for prayer. It could have been used by a group of people, probably a smaller group of people because of its size, and used in daily worship in the context of an Ethiopian church. And I wanted to show our visitors some pictures from this wonderful trip that I took in January to Ethiopia with my wonderful colleague, Karen French, who's one of our senior curators of, senior conservators of paintings at the Walters. And we had the opportunity to see some of these objects like this diptych used in the original context. So that was extremely helpful. And I'm just showing you here an example of the landscape. From an American perspective, I can only really describe the landscape as kind of a Grand Canyon on steroids. It's a very, the northern part of Ethiopia where we were traveling is kind of a high plateau, and there's lots very mountainous as well, and some parts are quite inaccessible. So you kind of get a sense of that landscape behind us there. If our visitors are familiar with any Ethiopian churches, you probably are familiar with those at a place called Lalibela, which has a series of churches, and they're very unique because they're actually carved directly into the living rock of the landscape. So the most famous of those churches I'm showing you here is called Beta Georgis, or the House of St. George. And that's just an aerial view just above, or just not aerial, I wasn't flying there. I was just standing on the rock above. And then also the side view as you're looking down into sort of the pit that it's carved into. And just outside of Lalibela, Karen and I went to a monastery church called Nakuto La'ab. And this similarly is kind of carved right into the side of the mountain there. And in that church are a couple of examples of how these diptychs or icons would have been used and stored originally. So you have a small icon kind of similar in size to the Walters icon inside a cabinet. And also on the left, you have a much larger icon, but you can see it's also a diptych. And this is kind of, you can think of this as person size. So it's about 5 to 6 feet high. And so you could actually in fact, we watch people stand before these and pray. And this is often part of a daily Christian ritual for a lot of people in Ethiopia.
That's wonderful. I think it's quite amazing that you got to see this work in situ. Oftentimes, that's what a scholar is tasked with, but it's just quite incredible that you have so many images of this work was used in situ, and it really does form kind of a better understanding, hopefully for our audience, but definitely for me, and how they were used throughout time, and sort of their modern placement in these spaces. And were there any other things that you gleaned from looking at these particular structures you went to go visit? Was it because lighting is very different? They're presented a little bit differently than, of course, that they are in the museum. I don't know if you have any other notes that you took from that time, or takeaways that you had from your time there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one thing I would say, it's a very physical act to go into these churches. I had a hard time. I'm not a hiker, but I had on hiking boots, and it's very sort of uneven. You're crawling through sometimes little hallways that are carved out of the rock to get from one church to the other. It's a real sort of physical act, but there are people, in fact, sometimes very elderly people, who do this on a daily basis to come and to pray. And so that for me was feeling that physical element to worship was something that I think, at least coming from my Western perspective, is not something that I'm at all used to. We have air conditioned places of worship and what have you, and this was a real physical act to go and to see these objects and to experience these spaces. So that was definitely a big takeaway from me. For me, at the Walters, we can't really recreate that for people, but we do show the diptych that I mentioned before. We show it in the context of other Ethiopian artworks in our collection. And they are in turn adjacent to other objects from other Eastern Orthodox Christian faiths. So Byzantine works, Russian, Armenian, Georgian. And now that I've sort of learned more about the history, I like to think about all of sort of priests and monks from those different contexts coming together in places like Jerusalem and Rome, as they did, and then conversing with each other. And they kind of converse in that way, the pieces in our gallery. In the same way.
Oh, well, that's good to know that we're staying really more true to how they're placed in situ. That's wonderful. And my next question is really if you could elaborate on the history of Christianity in Ethiopia. I think that for some it is actually quite a new concept they're coming to this new, right? We are familiarizing them, our audience, for the first time on how Christianity and the role Christianity had in Ethiopia that is very different than the rest of the African continent, or most of the African continent.
Yeah, absolutely, Joy. I think many people are not aware that Ethiopia is actually the second oldest Christian nation in the world after Armenia. King Ezana of Ethiopia adopted Christianity in the mid 4th century CE. And then he declared that Ethiopia would be Christian moving forward. So the Christian tradition there is quite ancient, in fact, almost dating back to the origins of Christianity itself. So this is also to say, of course, that over those centuries since then, the culture has become incredibly diverse. So you have a very significant Muslim population, also some Ethiopian Jews, very important part of the culture, as well as people who practice traditional Ethiopian religions. So it's a very complex and rich culture. We shouldn't just reduce it to Christianity, but that's what we represent at the Walters, and that's how it fits in with our collection.
I appreciate you saying that, because I think that's also something in kind of developing less of a monolith around Ethiopia or any other African continent, is that it's not monolithic. There are so many different stories within each culture, within each country, and of course from country to country. So I appreciate you doing that. Where is the geographic location of Ethiopia? And my follow-up question is, how did that affect trade and travel within Ethiopia and outside to Europe and the rest of the continent?
So Ethiopia is located in East Africa, and it's this real nexus between the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. So it was right at the center point of a lot of trade and travel routes. I know we like to think, we're the big travelers in the modern day, but in fact, there was a lot of travel in the Middle Ages and before that time. So you had all kinds of merchants and missionaries passing through Ethiopia all the time, and it becomes this sort of fulcrum for that region. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, that it was actually quite central to a lot of what was happening in the world in the earlier parts of history and today as well.
Right. I think that's great. And it will kind of fall into place for how European art is influenced, or how Ethiopians influenced European art forms, especially as it pertains to Christianity, as it pertains to the artwork that we're talking about today. And in comparison to other African nations, how was Ethiopia influenced by colonialism, if at all?
So the influence was actually quite small. Ethiopia's Christianity is not the result of colonization, as it is in certain parts of Africa. In fact, Ethiopia is one of only 2 countries in Africa that was never colonized. Some of you might know the history that it was actually occupied by the Italians from 1935 to 1941, which actually interrupted the reign of the Emperor Haile Selassie, who is a very famous name and many of our visitors will know. Haile Selassie was actually the last in a very long line of Ethiopian kings who traced their lineage back to King Solomon of Israel. So, and that's a very important part of the Christian history also, then the background of that to keep in mind.
I love that. Thank you so much. You're providing so much context today that I think is so crucial. And I'm curious, in regards to that, how were Ethiopians influenced by European art? And what does the Western dialogue get wrong about this influence? Because in talking with you and prepping for this, there's a lot happening here in general Western opinion about Ethiopian art and even European art in that mashup.
Mm-hmm. So Ethiopia had a wonderful and long tradition of painting, not just in the context of, first of all, decorating this wonderful series of early churches that were built, but also in terms of illuminated manuscripts. And so on the left, I'm just showing you one of the earliest Ethiopian manuscripts that survives from the 14th century that's in the collection of the Walters. And on the right-hand side, just an example of wall painting from a bit later from the 17th century in a church in on Lake Tana in Ethiopia. And so you can sort of see that it has this rich tradition, but it was about the 15th century that the panel painting tradition or the icon tradition really began. And there's a couple of reasons why that might have started. Of course, Ethiopia had a lot of connections with other Eastern Orthodox churches, so they would have been familiar with icon painting from, say, the Byzantine tradition. And also, beginning in the 14th century, Ethiopia was sending out envoys to places like Europe, so to Italy, Portugal, Spain, and making these diplomatic relations. And they were bringing back Christian paintings from those contexts back to Ethiopia. So the narrative that's often told is, they met the Italians and Italian artists came to Ethiopia, and then all of a sudden there was panel painting in Ethiopia. Well, it's not quite that simple. And obviously there was a much longer painting tradition in general. So I just wanted to show the left-hand side of the Phryseon diptych on the left, and in comparison with a painting by attributed to an artist that is one of the 2 Italian artists that were actually documented as having been in Ethiopia. So it's an artist named Niccolò Brancaleone. He was a Venetian monk, and many paintings have been attributed to him. So this art, this one that you see here is in the Walters collection, has also been attributed to him. And he was working at the same time and at the Ethiopian court with Ethiopian painters, one of whom was Phryseon. So you can, I often like to imagine this, don't know if it actually happened, but they might have been working side by side. And it wasn't like the Ethiopian artist was just copying the examples and the techniques of the Italian painter. In fact, sort of picking and choosing and bringing it into the Ethiopian context. And I think when you show these 2 paintings side by side, I think you can see that they're kind of in conversation with each other. So, maybe Phryseon is taking the general iconography of Mary and her son from the Italian painters, but Brancaleone is sort of adopting the Ethiopian palette where you have these just 4 or 5 colors, green, blue, yellow, red. And they're sort of, they're kind of coming to terms with each other and learning from each other. So I think what I try to do is kind of flip that narrative, that it's all about Italian influence, and to really think about the Ethiopian impact moving outwards. That's kind of how I think we should be thinking about it.
I think that's wonderful. I also think it's quite amazing, and it's just a stroke of luck that they exist. I don't know if they were collected specifically because they had such a close relationship, but it's just so great that we have something so similar to compare to, because oftentimes it's something wildly different, right? The subjects are so different, and we have to kind of like piece it closer together. But you can see so many similar elements here. Not to say again that they stole something from the other, but that they were obviously working at the same time and thinking and sourcing the same sort of visual language. And there's a lot that's different, of course, which is what drew me to the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say also, I'm showing them here on the same scale, but the Frey Seon is, I said, about book size, and that Broncholeon is about yay big. So it's a lot smaller. Would have been really, I think, probably for a private devotion, you can really hold it in the palm of your hands. So they look the same, but they're a little bit different.
That's good for context. Thank you for that. I'm very curious about the figure and the other side of the diptych on horseback and what the inscriptions in general are. I know that you have been spending some time researching the language, and I just thought this is another thing that spoke to me, was this little figure here on horseback, and why this character, knowing that I am not fluent in this particular language, why he takes up so much more space than everybody else.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Joy. I love Ethiopian icons and Ethiopian painting in general because as a former manuscripts curator, what happens in these icons is you have text integrated directly into the images that you see there. So if you do start to get closer and zoom in on that figure on horseback, like you were mentioning, you'll see that each of the figures are identified by inscriptions. That's a great help to art historians like me who need a little guidance sometimes if you can read the language. And also you've got sometimes even full poems written into Ethiopian icons. So yes, that figure on horseback really kind of breaks up this succession and this sort of this succession of apostles that you have here. You can kind of think of them in procession, and then it gets kind of broken up and isolated by this figure on horseback. So yes, one of my and I should mention the language that's being shown here. It's known as Ge'ez, or sometimes you'll hear it called Classical Ethiopic, and it's essentially the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So you can think of it kind of like Latin is to the Roman Catholic Church. So it's a liturgical language today. And one of my COVID-19 quarantine activities has been to take a series of really wonderful courses in Ge'ez, taught online through Catholic University of America in Washington with my very patient teacher, Dawit Mulune, and also several classmates who are thankfully much better at Ge'ez than me. So I have many teachers in that class. And when you zoom in on that figure on horseback, and right above his head, his name is written out kind of on both sides of his halo. And it reads Gi Yor Gis. And some of you might remember that word from before when I mentioned the Church of Beta Georgis, which is House of George. So what we have here is Saint George on horseback, and he was one of these really key figures, and still is, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. So he gets kind of pride of place in this icon and in many icons from the Ethiopian context.
I love that. And dare I say that, the character is a little cute, and I think it has a lot more to do with the horse than the figure itself. And, just the space in which it holds. And so I think that's what kind of can draw the eye, right, is the amount of space and the shape of the horse, and kind of the articulation of it is actually semi-accurate considering, again, the kind of space that he's working in. So it's really fascinating. I wanted to, at this time, take it to questions, if that is okay. And I don't know if you have any questions for me, but we will first start with Stephanie Mary. We have a lot of questions, by the way, which is really exciting.
Oh boy, okay.
Stephanie Mary, we'll do our best. Stephanie Mary asks, how do you get inside the church when it's carved below? I don't know if you want to go back to the image of the church, because that is a very good question. And you mentioned hiking boots.
Yeah. I had that question myself, and I think I was so taken by this Church of Beta Georgis that I'm kind of forgetting how I did that. But there's actually You see the pit carved down. There's actually some steps, and if you look at the side-on shot, there's some steps that go down that are carved right into the rock that you go all the way down to the base of the church, and you can enter it just like you would any church, which you can see folks doing in that image on the right.
That's wonderful.
But it's sometimes, yeah, it's walking on very uneven, sometimes very skinny surfaces, no railings. It's physical.
Yeah. Steve Delamarter, hopefully I got your name correct. Are there initiatives to digitize and preserve the artwork in churches in Ethiopia? I heard that a 1,000-year-old church in Zege Peninsula on Lake Tana burned down a few years ago. This is a very good question. I don't know if you can fully answer it, right? Because you aren't kind of in charge of making that decision, but
well, I thought that Steve was asking about his own project. Steve is one of my fellow classmates in the Ge'ez class, and one of those who is much better than me. He also has an incredible handle on Hebrew and Greek, as I'm learning. So one thing that I think Steve here is asking about the churches, and I'll come back to that, but I wanted to mention his project to actually digitally preserve the manuscript culture of Ethiopia. He's been traveling around the country for 15 years or more, Steve, or 20 years, photographing the manuscripts in some of these churches, in the National Library, and so forth, as a way to preserve and share that material. And I think that's really important. And there's so much more that has not been documented. Beta Georgis is an odd example in Lalibela because many of the churches have actually been, it's a UNESCO heritage site, and so many of them have been preserved by UNESCO. They've built sort of metal canopies over them, which kind of changes how we experience them today. Beta Georgis thankfully does not have that, but of course then there's the problem of it being exposed to the elements. So there are definitely efforts to preserve these works, like I said, in various contexts. And I'm not familiar with the one that Steve mentioned, but I think that's certainly a real concern to keep these structures alive as best we can.
Absolutely. I'm going to keep going through these questions. This is great. I think this is the most engagement we've had so far. So this is a great topic at hand. Emily says, can you speak to how Ethiopian Christian art influenced Western artistic traditions like the Italians or the Byzantine Empire? I think we talked a little bit about the Italians, but I don't think we referenced the Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, I mean, this is really what I'm trying to dig up, and I'm finding it difficult because I think that a lot of this history has been written by Westerners, and I think it's very much taken from the perspective of outside influence impacting Ethiopia. So what I think is really important to look at are these moments where you have these various cultures coming together, whether it's in Ethiopia or places like Jerusalem where you have that exchange happening. We certainly have examples of Ethiopian art that are found outside of the country quite early on in its history. So that's really where I want to focus and look at that. But I think, this is, one of the things you find is that you have, what I'm finding nice affinities are between not only just Europe, but also with India, for example. So you have Jesuit missionaries that come through Ethiopia and actually tried to convert the Ethiopians. And they said, yeah, no thanks, we're already Christian. We're not Catholic, but we're already Christian. So thanks, but no thanks. But there was a lot of exchange of ideas there. And then those ideas went out to Jesuit settlements in places like Goa in India. And so I've been finding some really interesting connections with things produced in Goa that really speak well to what was produced earlier in Ethiopia.
That's wonderful. And the last question we have here is from Leslie Hammond. Does this historic painting tradition appear in contemporary life in the church context or among artists in general?
Absolutely. And there's a lot of ways to answer this question. There are many artists in Ethiopia who are still practicing traditional church painting techniques. And Karen and I had the wonderful opportunity to meet a few people, a few men like this, who have just recently painted wall paintings in the sort of the main church in Aksum, for example. And so the traditions are very much alive. And there's also a lot of contemporary Ethiopian artists who have sort of used traditional Ethiopian art as a springboard. So sort of picking and choosing and using images of the Virgin or using the Ge'ez language to really inform their work. And so there's kind of two strains that are going on there. It's a wonderful question. And this is something that I'm particularly interested in, and which I should say has come into our country today. So one of the reasons why the Walters collection of Ethiopian art was built was to respond to our local community. Many of you might know that the Baltimore, DC area is the largest Ethiopian population in the United States. So artists were coming here from Ethiopia. They were being trained at, for example, Howard University in Washington, and continuing to practice in work that in some ways was informed by traditional art, whether directly or indirectly.
I love that. That was such a well-rounded answer, and I hope that invigorates people to kind of like look into that culture that exists in our state and in the tri-state area, because it's important and it does have a deep history here. So yeah, if we don't have any other questions, I don't know if you have any.
Boy, I have a question for you though. So it was actually, you were the impetus for this, me to talk about this particular piece. So I know why it excites me, but I want to hear about what drew you to this painting.
I was drawn to it by seeing brown faces in iconography. It wasn't something that I'm familiar with. Of course, this is not my area of study. And so once talking to you in preparation for this, it is very common, but I didn't know that before. So it was kind of interesting to see them in the context, to see them all as angels. Sometimes you see them in Europe, a brown or black face and as a particular figure, but to see everyone kind of as a brown figure. Also to learn kind of the background that the reason for this is not because there was kind of an colonial infiltration into Ethiopia. So that has a lot to do with why we see so many brown faces. Also, just the figure of George was just very endearing, and it took up so much space. And the fact that he was on a horse, like kind of, and not knowing the language, that all kind of drew me in. And I was kind of fascinated how much drew me in such a small frame of a work. So that's what drew me, and also the iconography of the Mary figure and the Jesus figure for sure. But the fact that they were all brown was really drew me to what is happening here. I know Christine knows. I would love to know more about this. So that's what drew me in.
Well, I wish Christine totally knew. I don't have the best answer for your question. What I found in my research, and I think the particular image we have of this diptych might like make their skin tone look a little browner than it is in actuality, but you're absolutely right. There are a variety actually of skin tones used in Ethiopian painting throughout its history. So I've been trying to look for patterns. Often people are quite drawn to it. And I think especially later in the history of Ethiopian painting, you'll get much more African looking figures for sure. And I think that really speaks to how long the tradition for Christianity was in Ethiopia. They embraced it as their own, and it was their own longer than it was in most other places. So that figure of Mary, it's really fun for me to look at because you get this image of Mary in that context. And this is something that I know I've seen a million times before in the context of European painting, but it's very much in that Ethiopian context. You have her framed by the angel Gabriel and Michael, and they've got their wings coming over her in this kind of little canopy, and that's very typical of Ethiopian painting. They're kind of protecting her with their wings. And you've got this really beautiful relationship between Mary and her son, this very direct interaction, which you also see in Italian painting too. Right. And so this is something that really gets amplified, I would say, in Ethiopian art.
And that seems to complicate two things, right? It seems to complicate the understanding of how race is depicted, or skin tone, actually, not just race, but skin tone is depicted in Ethiopian Christian art. And then also the other end of like what is the role of Mary, and how does the church the Ethiopian church protect her in multiple ways? And I feel like that's a whole other program that everybody can come back for, because that is a whole conversation about protecting kind of like holy entities and women. And hopefully you'll come back in the spring for that particular program. We have one last question, if you will oblige. It's from John, and they ask that they make a comment and then they ask, Ethiopian artwork reminds me of Haitian paintings. Is there any documented connection between the two?
I don't know of any, but the Haitian tradition would be coming from a West African tradition. And what I have been trying to do is to, you have scholars who work on West Africa and you have scholars that work on East Africa. And what I'm really interested in, and what is not usually discussed with Ethiopian art, is Ethiopia's relationship to the rest of the African continent. So what were those exchanges that were happening between East and West across the Sahara and so forth? You'll hear about Ethiopia's relationship with India, with Italy, with the Middle East, what have you, but you don't have that conversation there. So I'm really interested in that. That's a wonderful connection. Maybe there's something there that we can dig further on.
So thank you, John, for your question. And thank you everyone here that joined us today. Thank you for your questions. We had a lot today. It was outstanding. So we just want to thank you again to our audience for being so interactive today. I definitely want to thank Christine. Without that, we would not have this program. Included within that is our digital team. We want to thank them for having this up and running, keeping us streamlined and broadcasting to you all on a regular basis. I just, again, want to thank Christine and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in the next program. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.